she is like a great historian of political history, and she is going to give a talk.
Buonasera. Let me begin by thanking the entire IPO community, the International Federation of Philosophical Societies, and its president, Professor Eisu Kim, the Italian Philosophical Society, and of course my own university, Aldo Moro University of Bari, for inviting me to give the opening lecture for the 33rd edition of the International Philosophy Olympiad, with a lecture on the theme chosen for your work this year, conviviality. The very fact that this is a gathering of students and professors from different parts of the world with no less than 53 delegations is the first thing we are called to notice and are inspired by. This is because fundamental philosophical concepts are never mere abstract thoughts. However theoretically elevated they may be, they always emerge one way or another from people's lived experiences and from the events of the world. That is why, in launching the guiding theme of this Olympiad, I would like to start with something that is happening, indeed, taking place right before our eyes, namely your having come here to Bari with the desire to share with other colleagues and, if I may say so, with other friends, a path of philosophical inquiry and exploration, because friendship is born from the common search for the meaning of being. Thus, the investigation into the concept of conviviality must take on a convivial method itself. But the convivial method cannot simply be a mere exchange of opinions, a debate, or a combination of different viewpoints. That would not be enough, and more importantly, it would not meet the demands of true philosophical work. What seems necessary to me is to recognize, or rather to discover or rediscover, on what level of personal and social existence, of individual and community life, this phenomenon we call conviviality is found and develops. What question gives rise to it? What need does it address? What kind of experience does it indicate? This is why the theme of my talk is precisely philosophy as a path toward conviviality. If philosophy is a reflection on the being of things, starting from the conscious experience we have of them, it can show us how conviviality constitutes a fundamental dimension of our being in the world. Even more, philosophy will not only be a tool for clarifying conviviality, but it will also be one of the unique ways in which human beings are capable of engaging in conviviality. Therefore, to answer the question of what conviviality means for human beings, we must first ask what philosophical work consists of. Let us begin with one of the foundational texts for understanding the unique work of the human beings that we call philosophy as a path to conviviality. I'm referring to Plato's famous seventh letter, written around 353 before Christ. I quote, "To the relatives and friends of Dion, a disciple of his from Syracuse, who had recently been killed." The letter reflects on the relationship between the knowledge of virtue, that is philosophy for Plato, and the well-ordered politics of the state. We know that Plato's adventures, or better, misadventures, during his 3 trips to Sicily ended in failure concerning the idea that the ruler of a state could or should be a philosopher himself. Yet paradoxically, this political failure sheds even more light on the philosophical search, which will always remain other than its political realizations. This is because the knowledge of truth and adherence to what is good and fair require a commitment and a labor that always engage the self, that is, the awareness of the person. No social or political procedure can bypass this verification of the intelligent and free person, for it is there that the rational motivations and moral decisions arise, which support or critically oppose political actions. Plato was called upon by Dion to help reform the city of Syracuse through philosophy during the rule of the tyrant Dionysius the Elder, and especially his son Dionysius the Younger. The philosopher did not hold back his advice. I quote, "I told him that he must live his daily life in such a way as to become, as much as possible, master of himself, and to make for himself loyal friends and companions." End quotation. It was in fact due to a lack of trustworthy friends and collaborators that Dionysius the First had failed to retain control over the cities he had conquered in Sicily. For this reason, Plato went so far as to say, I quote, "The presence or absence of faithful friends is the greatest test of a person's virtue or vice." End quotation. So, if Dionysius the Younger had been deprived by his father of a good education and suitable friends, he needed to be advised to, I quote, this is an important quotation, "to be temperate, and then, having taken that path, to find among his family and peers other loyal friends, united with him in love of virtue, but above all," I repeat, "but above all, to become a friend of himself, a thing he greatly needed." End quotation. What stands out here is a crucial connection. The young Dionysius is encouraged to find other friends, philus allus auto ktesastai, who are in harmony with him regarding virtue. Symphonus pros arreten. To be symphonic, to live in symphony, means precisely to produce harmony among diverse voices. But more importantly, he is advised to do so for his own sake. Malista dauton auto. In short, not only must one gain loyal friends, those who share the same aspiration for virtue, but this is possible and necessary only insofar as one becomes a friend to oneself. Naturally, this has nothing to do with egoism or self-reference. Rather, it is about attunement with oneself. Like when a musical instrument is tuned, we can all immediately hear when a piano or a violin is out of tune or discordant. And so, following Plato, we can perceive when a person is not in resonance with themselves. Or, to put it more simply, when someone seems alien to what they are saying, when it is clear that what they assert or defend does not arise from their own experience, but is merely spoken externally without being truly lived internally. Becoming a friend to oneself does not mean overemphasizing one's own subjectivity. Quite the contrary. It means perceiving what resounds within the self, but which is not a mere subjective construction. This is what the Platonic Socrates calls the daimon. Think of Plato's dialogue, Apology of Socrates. Something that arises within me, but is greater and deeper than me. Or, in a specifically Christian sense, later echoed in modern thought, which in many ways can be seen as a secularization of Christianity, it is what we identify as the voice of conscience, a genuine call to be oneself, documented by what Augustine of Hippo called the restlessness of the heart. Inquietum est cor nostrum donec requiescat in te. Or what Thomas Aquinas referred to as synderesis, the innate inclination in the human soul to recognize good and evil. To speak of conviviality among those who share the search for truth and the tendency toward the good, we must therefore shift the focal point of inquiry from the external world to the inner realm of human consciousness. Put differently, conviviality with others, being in accord with them, is possible only by first attuning oneself inwardly. We find a similar trace in contemporary philosophy, particularly in the thoughts of Martin Heidegger, who described a fundamental structure of existence called Stimmung, the emotional attunement or mood through which we always feel situated in the world. This attunement can be authentic or inauthentic, depending on whether we understand ourselves properly or not. The human being as a Dasein, being there in the language of Heidegger, always exists in the world with other beings. But in inauthentic life, one understands oneself based on how one is perceived by the anonymous crowd, the publicity of common opinion, which homogenizes and flattens everything into what is habitual done, said, or thought. In this case, living with others comes at the price of losing oneself, of alienation, and can only become a positive bond to the extent that each individual Dasein, being there, stands face to face with their naked uniqueness, their being in their own right. Let us return to Plato's 7th letter and what we've gained from it. I summarize. The relationship of coexistence with others can only be established and sustained if it corresponds to a more fundamental relationship with oneself. It is worth recalling that conviviality is the formal definition of the Latin verb convivere, to live together, from which derives the noun convivium, meaning a gathering to eat together, specifically in the form of a banquet, the Greek equivalent being symposium. Why does one attend a banquet? Undoubtedly, and this is the most immediate answer, because one is hungry, because one feels appetite. But satisfying one's hunger for food is not the only reason to attend a banquet. There must be another kind of hunger, another need, or rather, the desire to be in relation, in contact with someone other than oneself. It is a personal need, a personal desire that drives us to seek this contact. And this is not only in an altruistic or edifying sense, to find in others the completion of oneself, but also in situations where the relationships is determined in a more negative or limiting sense by power, either the power of others over me or mine over them, for better or for worse. Coexistence with others always relates to what Hegel called the desire to be recognized, which is always accompanied by its dialectical shadow, namely the tendency to consume, to devour the other. So, to put it more simply, the convivium, beyond its traditional literary form, always implies, indeed, is always born from a need, from a demand of the individual self, namely the search for and discovery of the meaning for which each of us is in the world. This is the deepest hunger and thirst that underlies our coexistence. I am not speaking of a demand that is always clear, pure, or sincerely pursued. In human experience, nothing is ever simply straightforward, because everything is marked by time and space, that is, by our finitude, and at the same time by our freedom, our beings that cannot be reduced to the many constraints that surround us on all sides. The demand for meaning, the desire to discover why we came into the world, is often obscured by obstacles, habits, prejudices. But philosophy consists precisely in the possibility of reawakening that hunger and thirst for meaning, even when it seems to have been lost, as in the nihilistic culture in which we live. This is why philosophy is not only one of the demanding practices available to human beings, but philosophy constitutes the most important labor and effort of living, because it teaches us to live in tune with ourselves, while also seeking synchrony with others. As attractive as this perspective may be, it soon reveals itself as a challenge to prejudice and comfort. As Plato observes, those who love philosophy choose, I quote, the way of life that more than any other can make them intelligent, endowed with good memory, capable of reasoning in full mastery of themselves, and they detest the way of life that is the opposite of this, end quotation. Those, on the other hand, who are not true philosophers, but only have, I quote, a coating of formulas, are frightened when they realize how much effort and hard work it takes to live as philosopher. That is, I quote, how many things must be learned, end quotation. Thus, almost to justify their avoidance, I quote, they convince themselves that they already sufficiently know everything and that they no longer need to toil, end quotation. The passage adds a particularly important note to the connection between friendship with others and friendship with oneself. What is at stake here is not merely a feeling or solidarity or emotional affinity, but the realization that we do not already know everything there is or could be, and the need to keep learning constantly. Only those who believe they must continue learning can truly live together, in the fullest sense of the word, together with themselves and together with others. We find this idea again in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, in the section that deals with philia, friendship. Aristotle writes in Book 9 of Ethics to Nicomach, I quote, feelings of friendship towards others, and on the basis of which friendship are defined seems to derive from the feelings a person has toward themselves, pros et auton, end quotation. But the paradigm of the human being, the way in which humans most characteristically express their nature, is the virtuous person. Such a person, I quote again Aristotle, such a person is in agreement with themselves and wishes for themselves what is good and what appears as such. And they do this for their own benefit, end quotation, and more specifically for the benefit of the intellectual element within them. Friendship occurs when someone experiences these same feelings both toward themselves and simultaneously toward another who is their friend. Because, in summary, according to Aristotle's beautiful definition, I quote, a friend is another self, estigar o philos allos autos. And the highest form of friendship, hyperbole tes philias, resembles the friendship one has toward oneself, end quotation. Conviviality is friendship with the other insofar as it is friendship with oneself, and friendship with oneself is harmony with the thinking part of the self. We could say this using a more modern vocabulary. Conviviality with others is rooted in self-consciousness. However, this does not simply mean that the subjective self is the precondition for a relationship with others. Rather, and at the same time, it means that the relationship with others is also the condition and, in a sense, the very place where the subject becomes aware of itself. Over the long history of human thought, or at least, and I apologize for this, for my limitation, in the history of the philosophy as it arose in Greece, this relationship between the singularity of the self and the connection with other human beings has taken on many different forms and resolutions. Consider, for instance, this conception in which the human being is by nature a political animal, inherently disposed and open to coexisting with others, is the natural way for each individual to enact their own abilities and virtues. But also those views in which the human being is seen as naturally alien or even hostile to others, seen as competitors or obstacles to the fulfillment of individual goals. In the first case, we are dealing with the idea of a shared good that is naturally distributed among human beings, a common good rooted in a universal siblinghood stemming from either our shared membership in the human species or from a common origin in a creator. This principle, though interpreted differently, is shared by thinkers such as Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, John Locke and Karl Marx. In the second case, the focus is on the need to prevent or contain the violence that arises from the competition between self-centered interests, whether such partiality arises from human instinct or is seen as a theological consequence of original sin, through social contracts and conventions that restrict such impulses. Here we might think of authors as diverse as Augustine and Thomas Hobbes. But alongside this dialectic between a positive and a negative view of human coexistence, we can also discern another deep and never fully resolved tension. Should the experience of the self find its full realization in living together with others in the human community, or, on the contrary, must we recognize in each individual human subject a surplus of irreducibility with respect to social structures? We can also pose the question this way: does the fulfillment and purpose of the person reside in society, or, on the contrary, is it society that arises from and must be oriented toward the flourishing of individual persons? Certainly, human life can never be understood as simply individual or isolated, but always more or less, and in a wide variety of forms, as life in common. But life in common can be understood in two very different ways, either as a perspective of openness, transcendence, and communion, or as a closed, self-referential, ideologically stifling horizon. Philosophy can then be practiced as an opportunity to clarify critically and carefully what kind of path to conviviality is worthy of the deepest needs of human being, namely the need to discover the meaning of why we are in the world and to identify the good for ourselves, that is happiness. For this reason, if philosophy is a path to conviviality, it cannot simply dissolve or merge with it, because then it would easily become an ideology. Rather, philosophy must always continue to ask about the origin, meaning, and goals of our relationship with other human beings. The philosopher, in fact, is well acquainted with that irrepressible demand of reason, the drive to discover the why of things. From this demand arises friendship with oneself and with others. But no form of coexistence can ever substitute for the solitary adventure of the self. To conclude, I speak of solitude, but certainly not in a negative or limited sense, such as the lack of relationships. Here, for me, in this context, solitude means irreducibility and awareness that each of us is in the world with a unique and unrepeatable responsibility. I would even go so far as to say that it is precisely when we experience the convivial dimension of life most intensely that we understand how our relationship with others, and in the best cases, our mutual friendship, not only does not negate our solitude, but actually exalts it, our irreducibility. This is because our existence, which is at once finite yet free, as Kant once described it, is worth more than the whole world, not out of a presumption of omnipotence, but rather out of gratitude, gratitude for having been born and for having the capacity to ask why about everything. That is why a life in common is worthwhile and, in fact, absolutely necessary. Only a person who has experienced this kind of solitude at least once can truly understand what companionship means. Even more, they can understand that their solitude is the sign of a more original companionship, one that lies at the very heart of the self. Only in this way can the community become the home of the I. As Gilbert K. Chesterton once wrote, "Two is not twice one. Two is 2,000 times one." Many thanks.
Thank you.